Modi smiled, and Sundar Pichai's next words left the world speechless. The hall was silent. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on the stage, and yet the room felt like it belonged to only two men. Narendra Modi sat calmly, his hands folded, his gaze steady. Sundar Pichai stood at the podium, his voice still waiting to begin. Cameras blinked, lights glowed, and in that charged pause, even the air felt heavy. People knew something extraordinary was about to happen. It was not just a speech. It was something that could change the way hearts and minds saw respect, humility, and leadership. The hook had already taken hold. Everyone in the audience was leaning forward, not for politics or technology alone, but for the collision of human spirit and simple truth. This was not the kind of moment you could scroll past. This was the kind of moment that stayed in memory forever. Sundar cleared his throat. His eyes swept across the audience. He saw young students eager for hope. He saw business leaders calculating their futures. He saw families watching with children in their arms. And he saw Modi himself, smiling faintly, a smile that was neither casual nor staged. It was the kind of smile that carried weight. It told Sundar, "The floor is yours, but the truth you choose will shape everything." Sundar began softly. "I came from a small house, not very different from many of yours," he said. "My father saved for months so I could have my first bicycle. My mother gave up things she loved so I could study in peace. Today, I stand here, not because of power, not because of luck, but because kindness and sacrifice built the road under my feet." People shifted in their chairs. Some nodded. Some blinked away tears. The hook had turned into a grip. No one wanted to miss the next word. Then Sundar paused, his eyes meeting Modi's. The pause itself became thunder. Cameras zoomed in. Hearts raced. It was a pause that said, "Something more is coming," he continued. "When I came to the United States, I carried with me not wealth, not influence, but the lessons my parents gave me. Humility in success, courage in hardship, kindness even when no one is watching. These lessons are not mine alone. They are India's gift to the world." The hall erupted in applause. But Modi did not clap yet. He only smiled deeper, because he knew Sundar was building toward something greater, something that would break the wall between politics and humanity. Sundar's tone grew stronger. "Today we face challenges, division, misunderstanding, fear. But I have learned something from this land, and from the land I was born in. Fear is loud, but respect is stronger. Pride is heavy, but humility lifts us higher. Technology may connect us, but kindness makes us human." A woman in the second row covered her mouth with her hands. An old man in the corner let his tears fall. In that vast hall, strangers suddenly felt close to one another. Sundar was not just speaking words. He was opening doors inside every heart, and then came the moment no one expected. Sundar stopped reading from his notes. He closed the folder, placed it aside, and looked directly at Modi. "Prime Minister," he said slowly, "there was a day when my father told me something I never forgot. He said, 'Respect is not shown in titles. Respect is shown in how you treat the person who cannot repay you.' Today, I want to tell you, I see that same spirit in you. I have seen it in the way you bow your head to elders, in the way you speak of your family, in the way you remind this nation that greatness is not arrogance, but service." The hall went silent again. People held their breath. Modi's smile widened, but behind it his eyes grew moist. This was not praise. It was recognition. It was one humble man acknowledging another, not in politics, but in humanity. And then Sundar added words that no one could have predicted. "But I also stand here to remind the world that humility is not weakness. It is strength. And when leaders like you show humility, the world must learn from it." The hall could no longer hold itself. Applause thundered. People stood, clapping, shouting, crying. Cameras shook with the force of the sound. Reporters dropped their pens and clapped too. Modi slowly rose from his chair, not with the sharpness of a leader rising to command, but with the gentleness of a son rising for his father. He placed his hands together and bowed slightly toward Sundar. And in that instant, the world changed. Because humility had become more powerful than pride, respect had become louder than fear, and kindness had become the language everyone understood. But just as the crowd thought the moment had reached its peak, Sundar spoke again, his words carrying a new tension, a new suspense. Yet, he said, what I'm about to share next is not about India or America. It is not about leaders or companies. It is about something deeper, something that will test every one of us in this room. The hall froze. Modi's smile faded into quiet curiosity. The audience held their breath once more. Sundar leaned forward, gripping the podium, his voice lower now, almost a whisper, but filled with power. I must tell you about the night that changed me forever. It was the night I learned what true courage and kindness really mean. The hall gasped. Hearts pounded. No one knew what story was about to unfold, but every soul was ready to listen. And with that, the stage was set for the journey that would leave the world speechless. The crowd was still buzzing with emotion from Sundar's words. People wiped their eyes. Others whispered to their neighbors, but no one truly wanted to break the silence that hung heavy in the hall. Sundar had promised a story that changed his life forever, and the weight of those words pressed into every heart. The cameras zoomed closer. The world leaned in. Modi himself sat straighter, his smile gentler now, almost like a father waiting to hear a son's confession. Sundar took a deep breath. Years ago, before any stage, before Google, before any recognition, I was just a student. And like many students, I lived with more dreams than money, more hope than security. I lived in a small room, far away from home. The nights were cold, and the days were long. But there was one night that shook me, a night that taught me what resilience and kindness truly meant. He paused, letting the suspense tighten its grip. People leaned closer. Some clutched their hands together. The tension was so thick it felt like the world itself had stopped spinning just to listen. It was winter, Sundar continued. I had no proper coat, only a thin sweater. I walked miles from the library to my room because I had no money for the bus. I remember my hands were shaking and my stomach was empty. I told myself, just a few more steps, just a little more. And then, suddenly, I fainted in the street. The audience gasped. A wave of shock spread across the hall. Modi's face tightened with concern, his eyes narrowing as if he could feel the pain of that younger boy standing in front of him now. Sundar's voice softened. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of a small shop. A man had carried me there. He gave me water. He gave me bread. I did not know him, and he did not know me. Yet he treated me like family. He asked nothing in return, not even my name. That night I learned the strength of strangers, the courage of kindness. Tears filled the eyes of many in the hall. A young girl in the audience gripped her mother's hand tightly. A business leader lowered his head, ashamed that he had forgotten such simple truths in his pursuit of success. Sundar looked toward Modi again. Prime Minister, I know you also come from a life where struggle was not a stranger. And I believe you know what it means to feel the warmth of kindness when the world seems cold. It is not wealth that builds nations. It is not power that builds legacies. It is the respect and kindness we show to those who cannot repay us. The hall trembled with applause once more, but Sundar lifted his hand, gently silencing it. But there is more, he said, because that night did not end there. When I left that shop, I promised myself something. I promised that if I ever had the chance, I would be the one who lifted another when they fell. I would carry the same spirit forward. I would never let kindness stop with me. The silence returned, but this time it was heavy with thought. People were not just listening. They were reflecting. They thought of their own lives, of the times they had been helped and the times they had looked away when someone else needed help. The speech had turned into a mirror, showing people the parts of themselves they often tried to forget. And then Sundar leaned closer to the microphone, his eyes fierce with a sudden intensity. That night taught me humility. But later I faced a test much greater, a test that could have destroyed me or made me stronger. The hall stiffened. Even Modi's calm face shifted with a trace of worry. What test was Sundar about to reveal? What story carried such weight that even now, standing as one of the most respected men in the world, he still spoke of it with trembling? "I must tell you," Sundar said slowly, "about the day I was betrayed." A sharp gasp filled the air. The energy of the hall shifted. Betrayal. The word itself cut like a blade. No one had expected this turn. The story had gone from kindness to survival, and now into darkness. It was no longer about success. It was about the human heart, tested in its most fragile state. Sundar's voice grew quiet. It was someone I trusted deeply, a friend, someone I thought would stand with me. But instead, he stood against me. He tried to take what I worked for, and he almost succeeded. For weeks, I carried anger inside me. It burned me from the inside. I could not sleep. I could not think clearly. And yet, in that fire, I discovered something. The hall waited. Not a sound. Not a cough. Even the clicking of cameras seemed to fade. "I discovered," Sundar continued, "that forgiveness is not weakness. It is strength. Because if I had let anger rule me, I would have lost myself. But by forgiving him, I freed myself. I moved forward and my path opened wider. That was the moment I learned the power of resilience. Not just to rise after falling, but to rise without hatred in your heart." The audience erupted again, but this time the applause was slower, heavier, more meaningful. People were not clapping for the beauty of the words. They were clapping because the truth had touched them, because they had lived through betrayal too, and they understood. Sundar looked at Modi one last time for the evening, and his voice carried the weight of every lesson he had lived. Prime Minister, leaders are not measured by how much they win, but by how much they lift others when they rise. I stand here not to impress the world with titles, but to remind the world that respect, humility, resilience, and kindness are the only true foundations of greatness. The hall rose to its feet. People stood not just in applause, but in reverence. Modi stood too, his eyes shining with emotion, his hands pressed together in gratitude. Sundar bowed his head slightly, humbled not by the applause, but by the truth that had connected him to every heart in the room. But just as the crowd thought the moment was closing, Sundar raised his hand again. "And yet," he said, his voice trembling with new suspense, "there is one more story, a story I have never told on any stage. It is the most painful and the most powerful of all. And tonight, I will share it." The hall froze again. Hearts pounded louder than the clapping had. Modi's expression hardened into focus. People held their breath. What was this story? Why had Sundar carried it in silence for so long? And why choose this night to reveal it? The world leaned closer, waiting for the truth that would come next. The hall was charged with anticipation. People had already heard about Sundar's night of struggle, about betrayal, about forgiveness. But now he was hinting at something deeper, something that he had never shared before. The atmosphere was heavy. Even the cameras, usually so restless, seemed to hold still as if they, too, feared missing a single word. Modi leaned forward slightly, his hands pressed together, his face calm but intense. He knew that Sundar was about to open a door to a memory that would not be easy to hear. Sundar lowered his voice, and the hall followed. It felt like he was not speaking to a crowd of thousands, but to each heart individually. "There was a time in my life when I almost gave up," he said. The words were simple, but they hit like thunder. People shifted uneasily in their seats. Some clasped their hands as though bracing themselves. "I was far away from home," Sundar continued. "Everything felt uncertain. I had no clear path, no sure future. One evening, I received a call from India. It was the kind of call no child wants to receive. My father had fallen ill, very ill. I could not afford a flight back home. I could not be by his side. I was thousands of miles away, trapped between duty to my studies and my desire to sit by him in his pain. That night, I cried for the first time as an adult. I felt helpless, broken, and small." Gasps rippled through the hall. People had always seen Sundar as calm, collected, untouchable. But now they saw him as a son, just like them, carrying the weight of distance and grief. Modi's face softened, his eyes shining. He too knew the pain of separation, of family sacrifices that came with service and responsibility. Sundar's hands tightened on the podium. I spent hours walking alone that night. The streets were empty, and so was my heart. I asked myself, what is the point of all this? Why chase dreams if I cannot stand beside my father when he needs me most? I was ready to stop everything, to return home and let go of my future. I thought to myself, what use is success if it demands so much pain? The silence in the hall grew heavier. People were holding back tears. Some lowered their eyes, afraid that their own grief would spill out in front of strangers. Then Sundar lifted his head. His voice grew steadier, stronger. But that night something happened. My father himself, from his hospital bed, somehow found the strength to send me a letter. It was short, but it carried more power than anything I had ever read. He wrote, "Son, do not come back. Your place is where your dreams are. My strength is in your courage. If you give up now, my suffering will mean nothing." The hall exploded in emotion. People covered their faces. Some cried openly. The thought of a father, lying in pain, asking his son to stay strong instead of coming home, it was too powerful to ignore. Sundar's voice shook slightly, but he pressed on. I kept that letter. I still have it, and every time I faced a challenge, every time I felt like giving up, I read those words again. My strength is in your courage. Those words carried me through every exam, every interview, every disappointment, every success. And today, they carry me even as I stand here before you. He paused, his eyes locking with Modi's. Prime Minister, I know you too carry the lessons of your father, the values he planted deep in your heart. We are both men shaped not by luxury, but by the wisdom of those who gave us everything while expecting nothing in return. That is why I stand here, not as a COO, not as a guest, but as a son, speaking to another son who has walked a similar path. The audience erupted into applause again, but it was not wild or hurried. It was heavy, emotional, and filled with respect. People were not clapping for Sundar's title. They were clapping for the son, for the man who had carried his father's words like fire in his chest. Yet Sundar did not let the moment rest. He raised his hand gently, and the applause softened into silence once more. He looked into the crowd, his eyes deep with both pain and strength. But there is something else, he said. Something even more difficult to tell. I have carried it with me for years, silently, and tonight I will finally share it. Because the world must know that strength is not born from comfort. It is born from scars. The tension in the room grew unbearable. People leaned forward, waiting for the truth. Modi's expression hardened, as though preparing himself for something painful. Sundar drew in a long breath. The night my father passed away, he whispered, I was not there. The hall froze. No sound, no movement, just silence that pressed into every heart like a stone. I was in a classroom, thousands of miles away. I was holding a pen, trying to focus on a test when my world was breaking far across the ocean. I was not there to hold his hand. I was not there to hear his final words, and that guilt has lived in me every day since. It is a wound that does not heal, but it is also the reason I work harder, the reason I push forward. I tell myself every day, I will honor him not by my presence at his end, but by my purpose in my life. Tears flowed freely across the hall. Strangers reached for each other's hands. The story was no longer about Sundar alone. It was about every person who had ever lost someone, every child who had carried the weight of regret, every human who had struggled between duty and love. Sundar closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they burned with resilience. I tell this not for sympathy. I tell this because I want every person here to understand. Greatness is not about never falling. It is about carrying your scars and still moving forward. It is about taking your pain and shaping it into hope for others. That is what respect, humility, resilience, and kindness truly mean. The hall erupted once again, louder than before. Applause shook the walls. People stood, some crying, some smiling, but all changed. Modi rose too, bowing his head deeply toward Sundar. It was not a bow of formality, but of respect. He saw not just a leader before him, but a son who had turned loss into light. And yet, Sundar was not finished. He raised his hand once more, his voice steady but heavy with suspense. But I must tell you this. What I learned after that loss is not just about family. It is about the world we live in, about the way we see each other. And what happened to me years later tested those lessons more than anything else. The hall froze again. The suspense was unbearable. Sundar leaned closer to the microphone, his voice now sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. It was the day I faced hatred. The crowd gasped. Modi's eyes narrowed. The hall waited. What story was Sundar about to reveal? The word hatred landed in the hall like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were immediate and sharp. People shifted uneasily, eyes darting from Sundar to Modi, then back to the stage. Hatred was not a light word. It carried wounds, memories, and fears. Sundar's calm expression did not soften the weight of it. It only deepened the silence. Modi leaned forward again, his hands clasped, his face carrying both concern and readiness. He knew what was coming would not be easy. Sundar took a breath, his voice steady but low. Years ago, in the early days of my journey, I was not the man you see here today. I was simply another young man trying to survive, trying to build a future. But during those days, I learned something painful. Not everyone will welcome you. Not everyone will respect you. Sometimes the world will judge you not by your character but by the color of your skin, the sound of your name, or the country you come from. A murmur swept through the hall. People felt the sting of those words. Many had lived it themselves. Others felt shame because they had once been silent when it happened to someone else. Sundar's eyes grew distant, as though he were seeing the memory play out again. I remember walking into a room for an interview. I had studied every possible question, prepared for every possible challenge. But before I even sat down, one of the men at the table looked at me and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "He will not fit here." Gasps filled the room. The cruelty of those words, so sharp and careless, echoed like a wound across time. Sundar continued, his tone unwavering. I carried those words in my chest like a stone. That night I lay awake asking myself, am I less? Am I unworthy? Should I give up because some cannot see beyond my face, my accent, my origin? But then I remembered my father's words. My strength is in your courage. And I told myself, if I leave, they win. If I stay, if I keep walking, then every step will be my answer. The hall erupted in applause, but Sundar lifted his hand and the noise faded again. But the story does not end there, he said, because hatred is not defeated in one day. It returns. Sometimes it comes in whispers. Sometimes it comes in open wounds. I faced it again, later, when I was told that no matter how hard I worked, I would never be truly accepted. I was told to stay quiet, to not reach too high. But I want to tell you this. Humility is not silence in the face of injustice. Humility is the strength to rise without arrogance, to answer hate with dignity, to walk forward without carrying their poison in your heart. The hall grew emotional. People nodded, tears streamed, and applause trembled in the air like thunder waiting to strike. Modi's expression was stern now, not at Sundar, but at the idea that anyone could wound a man who carried so much grace. Sundar leaned forward, his voice stronger now. There was one night when the hatred almost broke me. I had worked for months on a project only to be told at the last moment that it would not carry my name, because I was not the right face for it. I remember walking alone in the dark, my hands shaking with anger and pain. I thought to myself, why fight? Why try? But then, in the quiet of that night, I remembered the man who carried me into his shop when I fainted. He did not ask who I was. He did not ask where I came from. He only saw a human being in need. That memory saved me. It reminded me that kindness is real, and it is stronger than hatred. The hall was silent again, but it was not the silence of tension. It was the silence of reflection. Every person was looking inward, questioning themselves. Had they been the one to give kindness or the one to look away? Had they carried hate or had they carried hope? Sundar's tone softened. Prime Minister, I believe you know what it feels like too. You have walked through crowds that cheered, but also through crowds that doubted. You have seen both admiration and suspicion. And yet you smile, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Because the world needs leaders who rise above hate without becoming hateful themselves. Modi's eyes glistened. He slowly nodded, acknowledging the truth in Sundar's words. Sundar straightened, his voice lifting once more. Hatred is loud, but kindness is lasting. Hatred seeks to divide, but resilience builds bridges. Hatred may try to break us, but respect and humility will always repair us. That is what I learned, and that is what I stand here to share with you all tonight. Applause shook the hall, fierce and unstoppable. People stood again, tears falling freely, hearts pounding with a mix of sorrow and hope. Sundar raised his hand, and gradually the sound softened once more. And then, with eyes that carried the weight of every story he had shared, Sundar spoke words that froze the room again. But what happened after that, what I faced next, was not hatred from strangers. It was a test from fate itself. It was something that shook me more deeply than any insult, more painfully than any betrayal. The suspense returned, heavier than ever. Modi's expression tightened. The audience leaned forward. Sundar's voice dropped to a whisper, pulling them all closer. I faced a loss that nearly ended me, he said, and it is a story I have never told until now. The hall gasped. People's hearts raced. What loss? What wound was deep enough to bring Sundar Pichai to silence all these years? The answer waited in the next breath, and the world could not look away. The hall was gripped by a stillness so deep that even the sound of a cough or a shuffled chair would have felt like thunder. Sundar's last words, I faced a loss that nearly ended me, hung in the air like a storm cloud. Everyone was waiting, hearts trembling, breaths shallow. Modi's face was solemn, his hands folded tightly as though bracing himself for what Sundar would reveal. Sundar closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his strength. When he opened them again, they were heavy with memory. This loss, he said softly, was not about work, not about rejection, not about hatred. It was about family. It was about love. The audience froze. Family, love, the words themselves were enough to stir hearts, because everyone in the hall knew those emotions carried both the greatest joy and the deepest pain. Sundar's voice grew faint, but each word cut like a blade. After my father passed, my mother became my anchor. She carried herself with strength, even when her own heart was broken. She encouraged me when I felt weak, reminded me of who I was when I doubted myself. She lived simply, humbly, but with a dignity that shaped me in ways no title ever could. But one morning, years later, I received another call. It was the same pain I had felt before. My mother, too, had left this world. The hall gasped as though one heart had broken across 1,000 bodies. Tears flowed freely. People held hands, strangers comforting strangers. Modi lowered his gaze, his lips pressed together, his face shadowed with grief. He, too, knew the emptiness that came with such a loss. Sundar gripped the podium tightly. I cannot describe that emptiness. I cannot describe the silence of waking up and knowing I could never hear her voice again. For weeks, I walked through life like a shadow. I smiled in meetings, but inside I was broken. I spoke to crowds, but inside I was silent. I wanted to give up. I wanted to close every book, every door, every dream. Because what use is success when the people you love most are not there to share it? The pain in his words pierced the room. People nodded slowly, tears in their eyes. They understood. They remembered their own losses, their own nights of silence and despair. But then Sundar lifted his head, his voice steadier now, carrying a new strength. Yet even in death my mother gave me one last lesson. She had once told me, Sundar, never let grief make you bitter. Let it make you kinder. Those words returned to me in the darkest days. And slowly I began to rise again. I realized that to honor her, I had to live her lesson. I had to transform my pain into compassion, my grief into kindness. The hall erupted in applause, but it was not the wild clapping of excitement. It was slow, steady, filled with love and respect. People were not just hearing Sundar's story, they were living it with him. Sundar raised his hand gently, bringing silence again. His voice dropped low, almost like a whisper. "Prime Minister, you too have walked through loss. You too know the weight of family gone too soon. And yet here you stand, smiling, leading, carrying the hopes of millions. That is why I say this not as a CEO, not as a man with power, but as a son who has known grief. Our strength as leaders, as humans, is not that we never fall. It is that we rise with kindness, carrying those we have lost inside us." Modi's eyes glistened. He placed his hands together, bowing slightly toward Sundar in silent respect. It was not a politician bowing to a business leader. It was one son bowing to another. But Sundar was not done. His voice grew sharper, deeper. Yet life does not stop testing us once we rise from grief. No, it tests us again and again until it is sure that we have learned. And what came next in my journey was not loss of family. It was a test of responsibility. A test of whether I would use my success for myself alone or for something greater. The hall leaned forward again, the suspense returning. People wiped their tears, holding their breath. What test was Sundar about to reveal now? He continued, "When I became part of Google's leadership, I thought my struggles were over. I thought I could finally rest. But instead, I faced a choice. I had the power to make decisions that could change millions of lives. And with that power came the heaviest weight I had ever carried. One mistake could harm thousands. One selfish choice could destroy futures. I asked myself, am I ready for this burden? Am I strong enough to carry it with humility?" The hall grew restless, the weight of his words echoing inside them. Many leaders in the audience shifted uncomfortably. They knew the temptation of pride, the dangers of power. Sundar's voice grew fierce. I decided then that I would never let pride guide me. I would let kindness guide me. I would make decisions not for applause, but for people. Not for power, but for purpose. Because true leadership is not about standing above others. It is about lifting others higher than yourself. Applause thundered again, shaking the hall. People rose to their feet, clapping with all their strength. Modi rose too, nodding firmly, his expression filled with pride and respect. But Sundar raised his hand once more, calming the room into silence. "And yet," he said slowly, his tone heavy with suspense, "there is one last test I must share. It was not about my past. It was not about my family. It was not even about power. It was about my identity, my very place in the world. It was the test that nearly made me forget who I was." The hall froze once more. Suspense weighed like a stone. What test could shake Sundar more than grief, more than hate, more than betrayal? Modi's eyes narrowed, watching closely. Sundar leaned closer to the microphone, his voice a whisper that carried like a roar. "It was the day I was asked to choose between silence and truth." The crowd gasped. What truth? What silence? The hall was gripped, and the next words felt like destiny waiting to be spoken. The crowd sat frozen, the weight of Sundar's last words holding every breath in place. "The day I was asked to choose between silence and truth." The sentence echoed in every corner of the hall like a drumbeat. Modi leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Sundar, his smile gone now, replaced by an expression of quiet seriousness. He knew this part of the story was not just about memory. It was about courage, the kind that tests a person's very soul. Sundar took a slow breath, his hands resting firmly on the podium. "There was a moment in my life," he began, "when I had everything to lose. My work, my reputation, my future. I was in a room filled with powerful people. They wanted me to stay quiet. They wanted me to look away. They wanted me to forget the values that my father and mother taught me, the values of humility and truth. And in that moment I had to decide, do I protect myself, or do I protect what is right? A chill swept through the audience. The words struck deep, because everyone had faced moments when silence seemed safer than honesty. Sundar's voice grew sharper. I remembered my father's words. Respect is not shown in titles, but in how you treat the person who cannot repay you. I remembered my mother's words. Do not let grief make you bitter. Let it make you kinder. And I asked myself, what good is success if I betray the lessons that built me? He paused. His eyes moved across the hall, settling for a moment on Modi, then sweeping across the audience as though searching every heart. So I chose truth. The hall exploded in a collective gasp. Sundar continued, his voice steady but heavy. I spoke even though I was told not to. I raised my voice even when it meant risking everything I had worked for. And yes, I lost things. I lost friends, I lost opportunities, I lost comfort, but I kept my soul. And that, I learned, is the only success that matters. Applause erupted, wild and unstoppable. People stood, clapping with fierce respect. But Sundar lifted his hand, silencing them once more. Truth is never easy, he said quietly. It costs you. It hurts you. It isolates you. But truth also frees you. And in the silence that followed my choice, I realized something even greater. That resilience is not only about surviving storms. Resilience is about standing in the rain without fear, even when no one else will stand beside you. The hall was completely silent again, except for the sound of muffled sobs here and there. The story was not just Sundar's anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been asked to compromise their values, everyone who had ever struggled between what was easy and what was right. Modi's expression had softened. His eyes shone with deep respect. He nodded slowly as if to say, I understand. Sundar pressed on, his tone stronger now. Prime Minister, you know as well as I do that leadership is not measured in applause. Leadership is tested when the world asks you to choose between silence and truth. And I believe the greatest gift we can give the world is to choose truth, again and again, no matter the cost. The hall erupted once more in thunderous applause, this time mixed with shouts of admiration. People stood, their clapping echoing like waves crashing against the walls. Sundar bowed his head slightly, humbled, but then he raised his hand again, and slowly, the sound faded into silence. His voice lowered, carrying suspense again. But I must tell you this, the hardest part of truth is not speaking it once. The hardest part is living it every single day. And when I chose truth, I learned that it is not a single decision. It is a lifetime of choices. And those choices shaped the man you see before you today. He paused, the silence heavy, his eyes shining with emotion. But even after that choice, my journey was not finished. There was still one more test, the greatest of all. It was not about survival. It was not about betrayal, hatred, or loss. It was about love, the love I had nearly forgotten to give, not to the world, but to myself. The audience gasped. Love, this was not what they expected. Sundar's words had already carried them through grief, betrayal, hate, truth, and resilience. What could love add to a journey already so full of storms? Modi's eyebrows lifted slightly, his eyes curious as though he too wanted to know what Sundar meant. Sundar leaned closer to the microphone, his voice softer now, almost tender. I realized that in chasing success, in carrying grief, in fighting hate, I had neglected the one thing that sustains us all, love. I had given kindness to others, but I had not given it to myself. And until I learned to forgive myself, until I learned to love myself despite my scars, my journey was incomplete. The hall was quiet again, but this silence was different. It was not filled with suspense, it was filled with reflection. People felt his words in their bones. They thought of the times they had shown compassion to others while being harsh to themselves, of the nights they carried guilt, regret, or shame without mercy. Sundar smiled faintly. When I finally learned to love myself, I became free. Free from regret. free from guilt, free to serve with humility, to lead with respect, and to live with kindness. And that, my friends, is the greatest lesson my journey has given me. The hall erupted in applause, fierce and unstoppable. People stood again, tears shining in their eyes, clapping until their hands hurt. Modi stood too, his face glowing with quiet pride and respect. But Sundar raised his hand one last time, his expression calm, his voice carrying suspense again. "And now," he said, "I must share the final truth, the lesson that ties all of this together. It is the reason I stand here today. It is the reason my father's smile, my mother's words, and my journey still live in me. And when I share it, I believe it will not just be my story. It will belong to all of you." The hall froze. Anticipation surged. Hearts pounded. Modi's eyes fixed on Sundar, waiting. Sundar leaned into the microphone, his final words trembling with power. This is the truth that left even me speechless. The hall was holding its breath. Sundar's voice had carried them through every storm. Poverty, betrayal, hatred, grief, truth, and resilience. Now he was promising to reveal the final truth, the one that tied everything together. The lights felt brighter, the silence heavier. Modi's face was steady, but his eyes were locked on Sundar as if he too waited for the last page of a story that had already changed everyone listening. Sundar placed both hands firmly on the podium. His eyes swept across the room, from the students in the back rows to the world leaders in the front, and finally back to Modi. His voice dropped low, carrying both strength and tenderness. "The greatest truth I have learned," he said, "is that greatness is not measured by what you achieve alone, but by what you inspire in others. All my life, I thought my story was about my success, about reaching here, about standing on this stage. But I was wrong. My story is not mine alone. It belongs to every stranger who helped me when I was weak. It belongs to every teacher who guided me, every friend who lifted me, every parent who sacrificed for me. My life is a reflection of the kindness of others." The hall erupted in applause, but Sundar raised his hand gently, calling for silence again. His tone deepened with intensity. "Prime Minister," he said, his eyes fixed on Modi, "that is why I believe leadership is not about being the loudest voice in the room. It is about being the voice that reminds people of their own strength. You see, respect is not about one man's power. It is about giving power back to the people. Humility is not about bowing your head. It is about lifting others higher. Resilience is not about never falling. It is about showing people how to rise. And kindness is not about weakness. It is the strongest force we have." Applause thundered again, tears streaming across faces in the audience. Even seasoned leaders in the crowd wiped their eyes, shaken by the purity of Sundar's words. He leaned forward now, his voice trembling with emotion. "When I lost my parents, I thought I had lost everything. But I realize now, they never truly left me. Their lessons live in me, and through me, they live in the world. Every act of kindness I give, every respectful choice I make, every moment of resilience I show, that is them, still alive, still shaping the future." The crowd could not hold back. People stood, clapping fiercely, some shouting with admiration. Strangers hugged each other. Students wiped their faces. Elders bowed their heads in respect. Modi rose, too, his face glowing with both pride and humility. He pressed his palms together, bowing deeply toward Sundar. It was a moment that transcended politics, transcended business. It was simply one man honoring another for his truth. Sundar, humbled, bowed his head slightly in return. Then he spoke one final time, his words carrying the power of a closing chapter. "I tell you all this not because my journey is unique, but because it is not unique. Every one of you carries scars. Every one of you has faced storms. And every one of you has the chance to turn that pain into light, that weakness into strength, that silence into truth. Greatness does not belong to the few. It belongs to anyone who chooses respect, humility, resilience, and kindness. And when you live by those values, you will not only change your own life, you will change the world. The hall erupted like never before. Applause thundered so loud it seemed to shake the very walls. People wept openly, their voices mixing with cheers. Reporters forgot their pens and joined the clapping. Cameras shook as they tried to capture the moment. And then, in the middle of that storm of applause, Modi walked to Sundar. He placed his hand gently on Sundar's shoulder, looked him in the eyes, and whispered words that only a few nearby could hear. "Your truth is India's truth. Your strength is the world's strength." Sundar smiled softly. And for a moment the hall felt smaller, warmer, as though the entire world had gathered not for politics, not for speeches, but for one lesson, one truth that left every heart changed. The applause went on, but the words that lingered were not in the clapping. They were in the silence that followed, the silence that said, "We will carry this with us. We will not forget." And thus the story ended not with Sundar alone, not with Modi alone, but with every person in that hall, and every person watching across the world, holding the same truth in their hearts, that kindness, humility, respect, and resilience are stronger than power, louder than pride, and greater than fear.